Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webcast, where we will be presenting ransomware, how to avoid the crushing effects of regulatory fines associated with a ransomware attack in the financial services industry. Presented by Michael Bryce, Paul Cayazzo, and myself. A little housekeeping before we get started. Everyone joining the conference is automatically placed on mute, but please feel free if you have any questions to write them in the GoToWebinar module on the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll get to those at the end of the session. Excuse me. My name is John Lucan, and I'm a managing director with SEC Compliance Consultants. I'll provide a more formal introduction from Michael and Paul in a moment, but first, we want to thank you again for joining us today for our second webcast this year focused on cybersecurity, and specifically today, ransomware. In January, we presented on penetration and vulnerability testing. The feedback was overwhelmingly positive, and I want to thank all of you who took the time to provide that feedback. We've added a short survey at the end of today, so please feel free to complete that, and I'll mention that again. We hope that you find today's topic just as informative, and over the next hour or so, each of you will have a little better understanding of what I believe is the most insidious cybersecurity threat today facing the financial services industry as a whole. Ransomware has the potential to wreak havoc in a very short period of time for those who are not prepared for this threat. If you need a graphic, think of the scenes on television after a hurricane or a tornado has struck a residential community. Now, while cybersecurity may not be life-threatening, think of the effect on your business if you cannot operate for a period of time because of your lack of preparation or your clients have been put at risk. The regulatory repercussions can be very severe. Our goal today is to educate so that you can better demonstrate to your various constituents, your clients, investors, employees, and the regulators, that you understand the various cybersecurity threats and have a reasonable strategy designed to prevent, detect, and respond to those threats, including ransomware. I expect there to be a much more public comment by the SEC and the other regulators in 2017 on this threat. For more than 30 years, Michael Bryce of BW Cyber Services has been providing technology security solutions across a broad spectrum of public, private, and government agency clients, including the heavy regulated financial services and healthcare industries. Michael's clients have included the U.S. military and Department of Defense, which makes sense, given Michael served as an officer in the U.S. Marine Corps, where he received specialized training by the NSA and signals intelligence. Following the service to the United States, Michael held executive positions leading IT strategy and related enterprise software services for various well-known firms, including as principal at Booz Allen, partner at Unisys, and chief information officer at the Industrial Distribution Group. Michael is a frequent speaker at industry events, and his firm, BW Cyber Services, provides an array of cybersecurity consulting to numerous NFA members and SEC registrants, including some of the world's largest and most well-known private fund advisors. Michael's clients also include the same regulators who may conduct an audit of you one day, where he provides specialized cybersecurity training to their examiners. And on that point, Michael's a key speaker at the NFA's upcoming member regulator workshop in New York on May 10th. And it's unusual for these member workshops to actually have a non-governmental person come in and speak. Michael?
John, that's very kind of you. I want to thank you for that introduction, and I want to thank our participants for taking the time out of their day. I know you all are very busy. So without spending too much time on myself, what I'd like you to take away or be prepared is it's not going to be a very technical presentation. It will involve and relate to technology, but our intent today is to walk you through on the operational side and get a better understanding in a non-technical perspective what ransomware is and how it might affect either you personally or your organization. So just briefly following up on John's introduction, I am the founder and CEO as well as Chief Security Officer of BW Cyber Services. I have a passion for this work. I've been involved in technology and in operations, whether they be classified and unclassified with the US government as well as financial institutions for the last 30 years. As you see on the slide here, it says former CIO. I always want to make sure people understand that's Chief Information Officer and not Chief Investment Officer. Lastly, what I'd like to just relay is that myself and of course my company and the team members within BW Cyber Services focus on registrants that include NFA, CFTC, SEC, FINRA, and we primarily focus on RIAs, hedge funds, as well as CTAs and CPOs, but we also do work for family offices and endowments. And many of the things we'll be talking about today will be real world examples of activities and clients we've been involved with, obviously sanitized, but you're gonna find out what we're seeing and what's happening from firsthand experience on the front. With that, I'd like to go ahead and turn it over now, I believe, to Paul.
Sorry, I'll do a brief introduction, Michael. Paul Caiazzo is founder and chief security architect at TruShield Security Solutions, where he provides strategic cybersecurity related advice to senior executives of a diverse client base, including several United States federal agencies, including the U.S. Department of Transportation and the U.S. Commodity Futures Trading Commission. Paul's experience is extensive, including cybersecurity architecture, information assurance, and continuous detection and mitigation programs with a focus on continuous monitoring, vulnerability management, incident response, and cybersecurity operations center support. Prior to co-founding TruShield, Paul was employed with Northrop Grumman Mission Systems and Savvis Communications. Paul?
Hey, thanks, John. And again, thanks to the audience for attending today's webinar to talk about ransomware. A little bit of background on me that I think is relevant to the conversation here, and specifically what TruShield does. We provide 24/7 security monitoring to organizations of kind of all shapes and sizes. And so we're really, I think, well positioned to be able to see exactly what the bad guys are doing on a day in and day out basis against our clients and against kind of tangential targets that our clients are then used to attack via compromised systems. We see that happen quite a bit. We see ransomware all over the place right now. And a goal for me within this is to give you some tips on what you should be doing both ahead of time so that you can prevent this sort of thing from happening to you. But then, of course, if you do find that you're on the wrong side of the equation on this, how do you recover from it? What do you do next? And then we're going to also give you a case study of a specific example that we recently saw. Hopefully it doesn't scare you too much because there are ways to combat this stuff, but it was actually a pretty frightening event for that firm that we'll talk about a little bit later. But again, thanks for your attendance today, and looking forward to talking.
Thanks, Paul. This slide's presenting kind of giving the agenda of what we're going to talk about, and I think Paul's already discussed that. We're going to explain ransomware, really how bad and pervasive is it, what's the impact with reporting, recovery, and the related impact, what are the attack vectors, meaning how is it delivered, this thing's mutating, and what are the controls and the mitigating efforts that you can put in place. Maria? Oh, how times have changed. My first exposure to the term ransomware was when I first saw Rob Chang on TV pitching his Made in America PC-matic product. And at the time, I think I was just more impressed with his gusto, no shame approach to marketing his product. But that quickly changed as cybersecurity started to appear on our industry's radar. So we fast forward today. Why is ransomware so critical to the financial services industry? Because the threat is so pervasive. Operationally, the probability of having to institute your disaster recovery procedures is drastically increasing. The threat from ransomware is mutating weekly. What is attacked and how the virus or that malware is delivered. That's changing all the time. It's very easy now for anyone to get into this game, and Paul and Michael will speak to that. Ransomware can shut down your business until that ransom is paid, or you've taken your backups and you installed those. And even then, if you pay the ransom, there's no guarantee that the keys to unlock the crypto lock will work. How prepared is your business to have all of your computers inoperable for a period of days? That's a risk that has to be considered. Regulatory 20467 and Reg CID, the identity theft red flags, comes into play. Now, I said earlier, I believe the SEC will start to make more specific public opinion concerning ransomware in 2017 and beyond. Part of this is because the proliferation of ransomware is going to drastically increase the number of firms that have covered accounts under Reg CID. So if you've looked at the rule before and you said, hey, I don't have covered accounts, I think you're going to have to start reevaluating that more frequently than annually. I know that many investment advisors do not believe that they meet the definition of a financial institution, and maybe they don't, but the risk is so pervasive that if not captured by Reg CID, then they will be captured by 20647. Reg CID provides the framework to assess that risk if you don't believe that you're a financial institution. Look, identity theft is defined as the fraud committed or attempted using the identifying information of another person without authority. Identifying information is defined as the name or number that may be used alone or in conjunction with other information to identify specific persons. And the red flag is defined as a pattern, practice, or specific activity that indicates that a possible existence of identity theft. Ransomware, when that pops up on a computer and you know you've been shut down, that's the specific activity. So as we listen closely to Michael and Paul, give some thought to your business and how this threat might be affecting you.
Thanks, John. So what is ransomware and what does it do? This is Michael Bryce, and what I want to do is walk you through from a very high level if you're not familiar with ransomware. And instead of it being a technical software discussion, basically ransomware is a form of extortion or blackmail that's used very effectively by both organized crime and opportunistically by individuals who may not even be terribly sophisticated. And the intent of ransomware is very simple. They want to find a way to lock your data, perhaps steal it as well, and on top of that, monetize that information by extorting you or your organization. And what happens here, which is particularly nefarious, is you're looking at an actual screenshot from a crypto-locked computer. And we'll explain what happens and how it gets in, but basically the net here on this screen is you're seeing the moment in which your heart jumps into your throat and you realize your computer's shut down. And as it explains here, there's a process to make payment in order to have access to your files again. In addition to having your computer locked down by ransomware or your network, and there's some notable examples. There was a medical organization out in California where the entire hospital was shut down and crypto locked. I believe it was shut down for a couple of days from a computer perspective. It's one of the most prevalent that's known. Most people, by the way, do not advertise or speak about this because of the detrimental effects on their organization. But in addition to having your organization shut down, we're finding now that criminals are also taking the data that you have and using that data to further monetize their operations. In many instances, they're taking that data, and if it's personally identifiable data, the information that John was describing earlier, information related either to your organization and your individuals or your clients or wire transfers or accounts related to clients, that information is being sold on the dark web. We're also seeing now where people are having their emails stolen along with this, and if there's any embarrassing information that they can use to extort, whether it's related to conversations you might have had internally about your clients or other things that most people would assume would not be made public, they're then using that to extort additional bitcoins and ransom. So what does ransomware do? Basically, after your network or a computer that is infected by ransomware is locked down, they're giving your organization or the individual who's been locked the opportunity to make a Bitcoin payment. If you're not familiar with Bitcoin, Bitcoin is virtual currency that's untrackable. To make a Bitcoin payment in order to have your operations restored. We'll talk about how long this takes and the impact on organizations in a minute, but what's scary about this is sometimes even when the payment's made, the extorters are not providing the key to unlock that data. So we'll walk through what can happen, how this plays out, and talk about some real world stories in which this has happened. Great. So let me provide a background here and use this in a very pragmatic example before we go over the activities here. Imagine if you've seen the old Pink Panther movies or the movies with the safecracker. He's got the little mask over his eyes, and it's a person who's got the stethoscope around his neck, and he breaks into the bank, and then he goes into the bank vault, and he's got a drill perhaps, and he's listening to the tumblers and spending hours trying to crack the safe. Those are the old days of safe cracking. Those are also an analogy to what hackers used to have to do. You had an individual who had years and years of computer expertise and experience, and they would spend days, if not weeks, trying to exploit an organization or a network. They would have to try multiple activities to get in. If we're going to use that safe cracking example of, let's just say, the bad guys on the Pink Panther movie when they're going after the Pink Panther diamonds, and a hacker, we have tools that have recently come out that are for sale now by organized crimes, mostly out of Eastern Europe, and they're utilized by hackers. They're sold on the dark web, and this just started coming out basically in 2013. So you don't really need to know what a remote access Trojan is, but basically what it is it's a way to get into somebody's network remotely. And it would be the equivalent, if you take a bank, of hiding somebody inside that bank, and after the bank shuts down, that person comes to the bank door and we're to let that burglar in. It doesn't necessarily, having a remote access Trojan, necessarily compromise your organization, but it allows somebody in. Then in 2014, along comes cryptors. Cryptors are a way now to just kind of, let's say, sneak that person into the bank or have them hiding, and they allow software to get into your network that could be nefarious. Doesn't necessarily mean it is, but it tries to get past your antivirus. And so this would be a way to find a way to sneak into that bank after hours without setting the alarm off. The third example that we're seeing now, which is Angler and exploit kits, and Angler is an exploit kit, there are many others. These are crimeware as a service, and this is the one that amazes me. Basically, we have criminals that are selling toolkits that would make it possible, and do make it possible, for any average Joe or Jane, you don't necessarily have to be that experienced criminal or hacker, to be able to break into your network, get into your data, and steal it, and then lock up your system and extort you. The example using that bank that I gave you would be that it would be as if we could give you a kit to break into the bank, to break into the vault, to get into the safety deposit boxes, to be able to get the jewels or whatever information might be in those safety deposit boxes, have Uber waiting outside, have that information, in this instance, those jewels, put in the Uber and sent straight to FedEx and shipped to your house. That's how easy it is now, virtually, for criminals to break into an organization, get access to their data, steal that data, lock the organization, and then extort virtual currency from that organization. And what we're seeing now are exponential growths in the people who have access to this, the ability to buy it online, and the capability to implement these nefarious activities remotely with extremely low risk of being captured or caught or identified. Not just criminals, but basically 15, 16-year-old kids that are just basically trying to find ways to cause problems in their spare time. So you see how cheap it is to buy an exploit kit, between $100 and $135. We're seeing now where criminals are not even charging people for these kits. All they're doing is sharing in the extorted profits that are made. And although we don't have it on the slide here, it's now over $1 billion a year business. That's with a B. Next slide, please, Maria. So to take from that and understanding if this is $1 billion a year business, what does that mean to you or me? Well, speaking from the left to right here, what you're seeing is a graphic that says basically during the prior 12 months, almost 50% of all organizations suffered some form of ransomware attack. That number is actually 47%. Of that, 41% were targeted at least 5 times, and you see the numbers there go up. So it's basically a coin flip in 2017, whether or not you or your business will be hit with some form of ransomware. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get crypto locked, but it does mean you will be hit, and you will hope that your defenses protect you. Put a different way, and this is just a figure from last year, in 2016, in the US alone, there were 56,000 ransomware infections. Now that's different than the number of organizations hit. Those are the organizations that are actually affected and either had to restore their data or make a Bitcoin payment. What's interesting here is a lot of people seem to feel, okay, well, maybe we have our network protected, or we're okay, or nobody knows who we are. We're also seeing an incredible jump in the amount of Android ransomware. That's mobile phones. Keep in mind, a lot of people don't even realize that their mobile phones could be locked up. Imagine if suddenly in the middle of the day, your phone is completely locked up. You may be able to back it up or to recreate it, but if you're like me, you need that phone so much and so often. We're finding a lot of the people and individuals who are getting locked up are willing to pay the ransom versus having to wait days or longer to try to unlock or to restore their phones. Next slide, please. So what does this mean? How are we dealing with this in the industry? Well, in the asset management industry, 1 out of 4 asset managers are expected to be attacked in 2017. If you remember the numbers from the prior slide, industry standards are saying that about 47%, and that number is growing, are going to be attacked. We're saying 1 in 4 are expected to be attacked in asset management. But I want to dig into this number because from the experience that BW Cyber Services is having with our particular clients, we're finding that 1 out of 2 is being attacked, and of those, 50% are actually being extorted to some degree or another. And these individuals and these organizations are extremely unwilling to talk about this publicly, and in many instances don't know what to do. Of those, 72 could not access their data for 1 to 2 days at all. 1/3 of them lost access and could not perform operations for at least 5 days. Imagine being out of business and not being able to trade or conduct business for 5 days. It's an unbelievably devastating impact on the business. In many instances, we're seeing that the ransomware is then being spread to their clients or their third parties, and vice versa. Sometimes ransomware is actually coming from clients who've been infected and then send an email to the asset manager who, trusting the client, opens the attachment or clicks on the web link from the trusted client only to infect their own business. And it goes on and on. I don't want to go too much into details into the cost of ransomware you see in the middle of the slide there, because these numbers are actually a little bit old now. I want to say they're about 6 months old, which is pretty darn old in the cybersecurity world. But the cost of ransomware has gone up significantly since this figure. We're seeing it's now between 2 and 3 Bitcoins, which is somewhere between $2,000 and $3,000. And that's the tip of the iceberg, just the extortion. The damage and related activities associated many times in calling in a cybersecurity firm like my firm or like Paul's firm, TruShield, to address and remediate the damages is not inexpensive. There's also law enforcement to call in, notification of customers if PII is lost, credit repair in many instances. The story goes on and on. So the hidden costs associated with ransomware are often more and much more expensive than ransomware itself. But the idea to understand here is it goes beyond even the potential, which is very high, and the costs associated. There are also regulatory and other associated impacts that we'll talk about in a second. With that said, let's go to the next slide. So, organizations that have suffered a ransomware or an extorting event basically have 3 notification constituents to keep in mind. If PII is involved, they need to notify law enforcement. PII meaning personally identifiable data. In instances we've had, one in Chicago and specifically recently, in which the FBI said, if you've lost less than $1 million, consider yourself lucky. We're too busy to help. With respect to ransomware, the FBI has actually recently stated that they recommend individuals who have not backed up their data, meaning they have no ability to restore that data, to pay for it. We have seen in other locations where the FBI has been willing to respond and able very quickly, and in those instances they've been extremely helpful, but it's a matter of hit and miss where your organization is and how bad the environment, meaning the locality has been targeted around you. For clients, notification to clients is situationally dependent. Again, if PII is released though, you must notify them. In our experience, being on both ends of this phone, being on the end where we've worked with clients worked with organizations who've had to tell their clients, as well as being a client for other organizations that have been attacked, it's our belief that it's always better to get out in front, no matter how difficult, because there are so many tentacles that go with this. Specifically, if information related to a client ends up on the dark web, and then it's traced back to a breach at your organization and you haven't notified them, the outcome there is much worse than the organization being out in front of it and working to notify their constituents up front. Lastly, the regulators. Now, there's no law or statute that requires you to report a breach. They would like you to report a breach, but right now there's no law or statute that requires that. However, you are required to notify if PII is lost during that breach. And many times we deal with clients that have not done any kind of cyber assessment or any kind of protections supporting their PII, and being unable to answer the question whether or not PII was released results in the need to go ahead and notify the regulators. And in many instances, that has not gone well. We can talk about later some particular incidences where the regulators come in. One is RT Jones, another is Stern, Aggie, and Leach, in which there have been fines because they didn't take appropriate protections. So that's how the regulators are looking at it, and that's both the SEC and the NFA, to include FINRA and the CFTC as well. They're all following the same approach to this process, but want to make sure that everybody understands that the tentacles going beyond an extorted event are much more than just paying a Bitcoin or two. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Michael. So we're going to pivot here and talk about what happens next. How do you recover from a ransomware attack, and then some of the other related and ancillary impacts, which Michael also talked about. We're also going to spend a little bit of time talking about attack vectors, and I want to make sure I leave myself enough time to speak about prevention mechanisms. This is Paul Caiazzo speaking. I am the co-founder and CEO of TruShield, and we see ransomware pretty much day in and day out on client networks or within organizations when we get called in to clean up in a lot of cases, working with insurance firms wherein a client may execute a claim against their cyber insurance. The cyber insurance firm then says, okay, have these guys come in and find out what happened. And so we see a lot of this on a pretty regular basis. And the unfortunate truth is there's really not too many options that you've got once you've been crypto-locked. We say you got three choices there, and really one of them is a non-choice. The non-choice being shut the lights off, go home, and close the business. Obviously, that's not a true viable option there. So really, there are only two. One is rebuild from backup, and truly, that's going to be the best option if you're able to do it. The problem there is that the vast majority of organizations that we've worked with, so again, this is boots on the ground, sort of our experience. We've seen people that may be doing a pretty good job of regular backups, maybe, but have never tested a recovery from backup. And unfortunately, the technical issues that come along with backups and recovering from backups and restoration can sometimes make that data corrupt. And so you may not even have the option to rebuild from backup. Although if you do, that's going to be your preferred option. So I guess word of advice number one, ensure you're doing regular backups of all of your critical systems, and then also make sure you're testing restoration. If you haven't tested restoration, then you could find yourself in a really, really tough place, thinking that you've done the correct thing and thinking that you've applied the, that correct kind of foresight, but are not ultimately able to, answer the mail on that. Secondly, of course, the option is to pay the ransom. Something like 70% of the people that get hit pay the ransom. And right now, that's, as Michael mentioned, a couple of Bitcoins, sometimes more than that. Bitcoin currently is trading at $1,300. I've seen ransoms in the 20,000 range. I think something like 20% of organizations that get hit pay more than $40,000 in the Bitcoin ransom. And the problem with that is you're effectively, you're negotiating with a thief, right? So there's not really any guarantee that if you pay the ransom, that individual is going to be of high enough moral standing to either give you the correct encryption keys, and you're entirely reliant upon them to do that. And then secondarily to that they're not going to come back, maybe 2-3 weeks later and hit you again. And that's actually a very, very common thing. If you've been hit by some ransomware attack and you've paid the ransom, it's very likely that they're going to come back sometime later and test the water, see whether or not you learn the lesson. One thing though that's worth noting here is that, again, if you don't have a good backup, you're stuck. You're paying the ransom, and the FBI actually tells people pay the ransom, because if your choice is either lose everything or pay the ransom, you basically, again, you have a non-choice in that regard. The other stuff that Michael had mentioned earlier with respect to the related impacts, truly this is where the real cost comes in. Incident response is typically very expensive, and from a provider's standpoint, it's really because we need to be able to align very highly skilled individuals with a very urgent need at a client site, perhaps at the drop of a dime, and trying to draw that window of downtime down so that you're in the the lower end of the companies that suffer the extended downtime. That's really our job. That's costly because those guys are again highly skilled, highly paid individuals that have to come out and do the cybersecurity analysis of your environment, do the forensic analysis, and try to understand what actually happened. Replay the clock a little bit to find out what the attack vector was that brought that ransomware into the environment. And then, of course, you've got all of the other ancillary charges associated with it, such as consulting your attorney. And in many cases, incident response requires going through an attorney. In fact, that's one thing we sometimes counsel clients to do, is include during that initial declaration of an incident, talk to your attorney first, so that effectively everything from there is covered under client attorney privilege. As Michael was mentioned earlier, you have to do those client notifications if PII has been exposed. If it's not a requirement, and may be a significant reputation impact if you do get that out there, which is why the vast majority of this stuff goes unreported. I think something like less than 25% of ransomware actually gets reported. So when you look at these massive statistics, like for instance, the one that Michael was talking about on March 2016, 56,000 single infections during that 1 month, 25% of the total amount are reported. So think about that for a second. There's also going to be other costs associated with just loss of business, opportunity costs. If word gets out amongst the relatively small asset management community that you did by either through your own technical negligence or perhaps through no control of your own, one way or another you had a security incident that potentially impacted both financial data or PII, that's going to be a reputation impact, and you can potentially lose some customers as a direct result of that. Additionally, investors may look at that and say, I don't know whether or not this is the right manager to have my funds with. And I'll promise you one thing is certainly true, that in the process of responding and cleaning up from one of these things, this is going to require your attention. And that's time that you're not operating for your clients. It's time that you're working with a firm such as ours, trying to get you back to a healthy state. And it's very stressful. And I think the case study I'm going to give you in a few minutes here, I think will highlight some of that stress. But go ahead, I want to talk about the attack vectors. And this next slide, I'm really going to be speaking about how this stuff happens and what you should be doing to protect yourself. And again, I want to spend a little time on this. But I'll tell you, the vast majority of ransomware comes in via social engineering. So social engineering includes things like phishing, spear phishing, text messages, through social media, potentially through a USB drive that maybe you picked up at a trade show or something along those lines. Vast majority of the time, that's where it's coming from. In fact, if you look at some of the statistics around this, something like 40% of all spam email has ransomware attached to it. So if you ever think spam is just simply a nuisance that's clogging up your inbox, that's really not the case anymore. The vast majority of this stuff has malicious links or attachments directly in it. Phishing emails you're going to get all the time. And the thing is that these days it's become rather easy to construct pretty sophisticated phishing campaigns. Michael was talking earlier about the Angler exploit kit, and one of the components of that tool also has a social engineering kind of part that allows you to do some of this stuff. You can make a very cleverly crafted phishing attack that looks like it may come from your bank or like it may come from some trusted third party, and it's targeting you specifically. In those cases, that's going to be a spear phishing attack, and those spear phishing attacks are usually pretty effective. Unless you're very well trained on what to look for and how to protect yourself against a phishing attack, especially a well-constructed spear phishing attack, you're likely to open that email. And sometimes, truly, even if you just open the email, if you're using an HTML-enabled email client, like let's say Google, or any of the other cloud-based email clients, just opening the email could potentially be enough. If an image gets displayed in that email, that display of the image could actually inject some code into your web browser, which allows the rest of this stuff then to happen. Those are very, very, very common. And I would say the majority of the time when we get called in to clean up after a ransomware incident, usually we do discover that it's coming through phishing. And sometimes it's very basic phishing where you think a individual just getting a little bit of extra awareness or a little extra training around how to observe and how to kind of thwart a phishing attack would have solved the problem or would have prevented it from happening in the first place. And then, sometimes you do see the much more concerted efforts where an individual is specifically targeted. Again, those are pretty effective. So visiting malicious websites. Now, you may think, well, I don't go to malicious websites. I don't go to any bad websites. I browse CNN, or I look at some technology news sometimes, or financial news, things like that. And that's great. That's probably very true that you're not looking at perhaps the dark underbelly of the internet. However, the problem with that is the bad guys they're buying ad space on the legitimate websites, and then those ads, they may look like it's an ad for some legitimate service or product, but what it actually is malware. And there's code embedded in that ad, and simply serving it up to you within your web browser could potentially exploit you. And that's one thing that I think most people don't even realize, that just by browsing the wrong website, you could be popped. Of course, if you download some malicious software, that's a great way to get yourself infected. So I would highly recommend anybody to stay away from torrents like the Pirate Bay, or downloading cracked software to avoid license fees, things like that. More often than not, that stuff comes with viruses or with other malware. And right now, the most prevalent malware is all ransomware. Malicious text messages are another way that I've seen it happen. And again, this is a highly social engineered sort of approach, very similar to a phishing attack, wherein that text message may appear to come from somebody and asks you to click a link. Once you do that, again, same attack vector from there. It's going to inject some code either into your phone, like what Michael was again mentioning earlier on Android infections are spiking. We're seeing that a lot. It happens on iOS too. And one thing to that note, what I've seen more recently is what's called brick locker, where rather than simply lock your device, it can brick it or turn it into a useless piece of hardware at that point. Erase the firmware and make the thing completely non-functional. That is less financially motivated, more kind of a nuisance or chaos motivates individuals that do that sort of thing, but it's possible to do, and I see that happen via text messages quite a bit as well. Social media is another one where, again, the vector is going to be similar, where you're going to be invited or enticed to click a link or to view some content that may be interesting to you. And a lot of times, again, with the targeted stuff, the bad guy may be profiling you for some time, may do that via LinkedIn, maybe do that via Twitter or via Facebook, looking at things that you're interested in, and then crafting those targeted attacks to take advantage of what you kind of publish about yourself as what you're interested in. And that's where that spear phishing becomes extremely effective. If you get an email that looks like it came from perhaps a charitable foundation that you work with that is notifying you of an event coming up, you may be very well inclined to open that email and click the link to register for the event. And just doing that right there is probably enough to get you owned. USB drives, I think, are probably less common with respect to ransomware, but malware certainly gets spread by that. I have a personal policy where I don't plug USB drives into my devices unless I own and have maintained control over that USB drive basically since I bought it, because I don't trust them. It's a very easy way to transfer malicious files from one device to another. Misconfigured firewalls is certainly a vector, and you have to be aware of what good firewall practices are. but probably a less common attack vector for ransomware specifically. A misconfigured firewall could certainly let a bad guy into your environment and is not something that should be taken lightly. But when speaking specifically about ransomware, we see it more often through the phishing attacks. And so before we move on from this slide, a couple of things where we're going to talk about prevention. So the vast majority of the phishing emails, the way that this works is they'll include a attachment, and that attachment will have the ransomware built into it. So if you're well coached into not opening attachments that you don't recognize or from people that you're not expecting attachments from, you're going to be a little bit better prepared than perhaps some others that have not received that training. One thing to note is that ransomware, what I've observed, what we've seen is that it's typically going to be facilitated via what's called a macro-enabled Word document or Office document. So there are ways to configure your email gateways to block macro-enabled attachments, and doing that is a great prevention mechanism right there. That's a good way to stop a lot of the stuff at the network edge that doesn't actually land on your computer. And of course, if you can prevent it, that ounce of prevention is worth 10 pounds of cure in this case. That's probably one of the better recommendations we can leave you is make sure that your email gateways are configured to block macro-enabled attachments. And then additionally to that, one other, and I know Michael said we're not going to get too technical, this is the last technical thing I'm going to talk about. If your individual desktops or devices are configured to block executables from the user space, that is going to stop the majority of ransomware as well. So coupling those two things together, and if you're not familiar with technical components of how to do that stuff, that's where an organization like ours would come in. It can help either configure that stuff or tell you how to configure it, and we can certainly walk you through that. But at the end of the day, really the key thing is it comes down to awareness and knowing that you are under attack, whether or not you think you're a target, you are under attack, and being able to pick out those phishing attacks from the legitimate emails is going to be the key thing. And now I'm going to talk about a case study wherein the unfortunate victim was not prepared and was not sufficiently able to protect themselves from an attack. So the case study that we're going to talk about here is related to a services organization that we were brought in by an insurance company. And so the insurance company said, hey, TruShield, one of our clients executed a claim against their cyber insurance policy, and we need your help in understanding what actually happened here, whether or not they were negligent or whether or not they were able to prevent this, or whether or not there was a real need to actually pay the ransom out. And so this was a small services organization, less than 30 employees. And what ended up happening is they had effectively a basic phishing attack that landed a piece of ransomware called Locky on the end user's computer about 3 days from the end of the month. What that means is that their computers were all locked, they were crypto locked out of all of their systems, basically right at the month close. And for those of you guys who run your own business, that I'm sure you can probably think to yourself, man, if I was locked out of my systems 3 days from the end of the month, that would be a very, very bad day for me. This was a very clear example of an organization that did not feel that they were a target. They were not on anyone's radar from their perspective. And they, as a result of that, had pretty relaxed security practices. I see this all the time when dealing with clients, especially when we're brought in after the fact. They all have that misconception, the I'm not a target misconception. And what that really allows is for the bad guy to gain just a single foothold that can spread so quickly that it's not really possible for the organization to do anything about it. No internal controls within this particular environment allowed Locky, which was a very damaging piece of ransomware. In fact, that 56,000 attacks in March of 2016, most of that was Locky. Locked this organization out of their accounting, their payroll, their vendor management systems, and basically all of their operational and productivity systems. So what that means is that, again, 3 days before month close, they couldn't run payroll, they couldn't do accounts payable, they couldn't do accounts receivable, and they had nothing that they could do. They had no good backups. This is, again, an organization that was very ill prepared to be able to do anything about it. And so, they called their insurance company. And so at the end of the day, these guys were forced to pay the ransom. I believe it was 4 Bitcoins that they had to pay. And then again, the key thing there is the Bitcoin is not necessarily going to be the most significant expense out of this. You also are going to have to pay an organization like ours to come in and clean things up, or at least help you understand what happened so that you can, ensure it doesn't happen again. This happens every single day to organizations of all different types and sizes, different industries, every single day. So again, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure here. Make sure you're taking good backups, doing restorations from backups, and training your people on how to identify phishing attacks. And so I'm going to hand back over to Michael to close out the presentation here.
Yeah, Paul, thank you very much. We're coming up on 1 o'clock. So if you all can stay a couple minutes beyond, we're happy to take questions, and we'll stay as long as you all would like. I know some people have firm stops. So before I go into this last slide, I did want to mention that we've talked about phishing a lot, and we didn't really go into detail. As I hopefully everybody understands, phishing is just getting an email that is trying to trick you into clicking something. Spear phishing is when it's directed to you and it's more personal. Because of how prevalent spear phishing has become, for attendees on today's call, we're offering a free phishing test for you. Basically, we'll set your organization up with up to 20 of your individual users and show you all what a phishing attack would look like, help you to understand whether or not your organization is susceptible to some of the activities that could result, specifically if you're vulnerable to a ransom attack from phishing. Keep in mind, the reason why phishing is so prevalent, over 1 billion emails go out every day. And I want to say of that number, there are hundreds of millions of spam emails, if not close to 1 billion spam now, depending on the statistics you look at. If just a tiny portion of those emails are successful, which they are, that's how criminals are able to make money, and that's why they continue to use some of these silly spam emails, but they're becoming much more sophisticated. So just shoot an email back to the presenter at the end of this presentation if you're interested in having your organization sign up for a phishing test. So what can you do to protect yourself from ransomware? Without a doubt, #1 control is to start with training. And it's just, I would say for the individuals on the call here, you've already started your training. It's organizational training. It's making sure individuals understand what a malicious or potential phishing email might look like, because obviously these things don't come across labeled, this is ransomware, don't click us, or this is a malicious email, don't read me. And then from that, how to respond or not to respond if they get an email like that. Equally as important, especially what the regulators are looking for, is cybersecurity assessment for your organization, to know that you've understood not just training, but also vulnerabilities and weaknesses, the most common ones, and how to address those. And Paul mentioned a couple of the most common controls and how very easy they are to implement. Penetration testing is a previous webinar we did that was very well received, and it's the next step for organizations who've done training and have done a cybersecurity assessment, and it's very effective in identifying the weaknesses that criminal organizations and others would be able to identify in the course of an attack. And then lastly, it's industry best practices, and we won't go through those here for lack of time, but it's the 80-20 rule. It's the simple things that are the easiest to implement that also provide the best security. Things like password complexity, software patching and updating, just making sure the organization has virus and malware scanning. It surprises me how many organizations do not have it in place, or they might have it on people's computers, but on their servers. There are a number of other activities, and Paul had mentioned those there, we won't go into, but the point here is it's not actually terribly difficult for organizations to protect themselves, but there are steps that needs to be taken. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and turn it over here to John to close out for us.
Thanks, Michael. I hope everyone has a better understanding of what ransomware is and how significant the threat is. It scares me. I'm a compliance consultant. I'm not an IT expert, although sometimes my clients think I am. The advice I give my clients is assess the risks, know what your risks are, and be able to design a program to address those risks and be able to communicate that to your different constituents. And if you can do that, then from a regulatory perspective, even if you are hacked or hit, if you've taken reasonable precautions, at least you're able to have some defense against that regulatory backlash that may come at you. And that's going to bring us to the end of the webinar, and we apologize for the technical difficulties at the beginning. If you look on the right side of your screen at that, go to webinar module that's there. There's going to be a link to a survey. If you feel so inclined, please provide your feedback. We will have another webinar coming up in the end of May on phishing. I believe, Maria, I'm not sure of the exact date. It's May 23rd or 25th, I believe. But in the next day or two, we will send out a follow-up email with a link to this recording, and we'll highlight the timing of that other event. So thank you very much. And if you have any questions now, please feel free to ask us.
Hi there. I do have one question for Michael. Michael, what is your biggest issue or concern related to ransomware?
Good question, Maria. Thank you very much. It's interesting. If training is the #1 way to protect against ransomware, the biggest threat is that, at least speaking from the clients we have, that as risk managers, as John mentioned, and some of the best risk managers in the world, and definitely in any industry I've ever been in, managers and compliance officers alike tend to not understand the risk associated with cybersecurity. And this is a perfect example, ransomware, of the risk that an organization assumes by, in many instances, being ignorant of the outcomes from a cyber attack like ransomware. And so I'd say the absolute biggest issue is just not understanding that risk out there and taking basic steps to mitigate it.
Thanks, Michael. Okay, next question is for Paul. Paul, are ransomware infections only for PCs, and is my smartphone safe?
Okay, so while I think in most cases, or at least in many, that initial infection is going to be on the PC, what I typically see happen is the ransomware spreads out throughout a network really, really quickly and can move from the PC or laptop over to the server environment, in a flash. And that's when it becomes really damaging, because then it's locking up things like shares, network shares, or file shares, or maybe databases that you use for your day-to-day operations. Certainly smartphones are at risk. There's no question that there's been a big uptick in the amount of ransomware that is affecting smartphones. And that's, from my perspective, I think you got to look at your smartphone as a computer that you're holding in your hand. There's really no difference between a smartphone and a laptop. At the end of the day, it runs an operating system, it runs your web browser, it has an email client just like your laptop does. So consider it to be effectively a smaller version of your desktop, your laptop, your PC. And absolutely, yes, they are also at risk. I'm not sure if I have any statistics around specifically how many Android phones were hit, but I would expect, given the trends that I see within other types of malware, there's a much greater interest in attacking the smartphone from the bad guy's side right now, and I would imagine ransomware is right up there with it. So if they're not currently the most targeted, I would expect within 2017 they probably will be.
Great, thank you, Paul. I do have a question for John. John, why should we be aware of this now?
It's from the financial services industry, it is so pervasive, as I think we've learned. If you look at some of those graphs, how it's increasing, how the bad guys are trying to get into our systems, that, as I said earlier in my presentation, the SEC is going to speak a lot more about this risk, in 2017 and beyond. That I think that as folks in the financial service industry, we need to understand the risk, and we need to draw up policies and procedures to identify the risks and understand what they are. And in the case of ransomware, I think it's going to be front and center for a long, long time.
Great, thank you, John. Another question for you, Michael. How do the regulators view ransomware? Specifically, must a ransomware attack be reported?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the way the regulators are looking at it is twofold. The first is they're wanting to know if the organization has taken the basic steps with respect to compliance for cybersecurity. They're pragmatic, especially in my dealings with the NFA. And by the way, if you're not aware, the NFA is having a workshop on the 10th of May in New York and the 11th in Chicago on cybersecurity. And the way they're looking at it is, if, and this is the SEC and FINRA also, that if the organization has put in place a cybersecurity program and taken some basic steps to address their risk and mitigate that risk, then it's not a matter of if, but when. And as such, they're accepting of it and they're not hammering people. It's when organizations have not taken those appropriate steps that they're then hammering them and following up with findings. So I would say the regulators aren't so much focused on ransomware versus any other breach equally. It's just a matter of how well the organizations have taken appropriate steps to perform their duties to protect that data. Now, the caveat there is if PII is released, or if you cannot determine whether or not PII is released because your organization has not taken any additional protections on PII, or at least evaluated where it is, they are going to look unfavorably to that.
Thank you, Michael. And Paul, do you have one last announcement for us?
Yeah, so again, I think John mentioned that our next webinar coming up is going to be focused specifically on phishing. That is going to be on May 23rd from 12 to 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So be on the lookout for an invitation to that. And again, also, as Michael alluded to, we collectively are going to be offering some free phishing assessments to attendees to both this and the phishing webinar. So if you're interested in engaging us on that, again, it's no cost to you. And it's probably a very informative way to understand how susceptible you are to some of this stuff. Feel free to reach out to either Michael, myself, or John for more information on that. So again, lastly, we thank you guys all for your attendance today, and hope you all have a wonderful rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.